Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second presentation here today and the first day of the UAGC Research Symposium. I'm Dr. Tim Rice, and I'm the lead faculty member of the Doctor of Psychology program here at UAGC. And it's with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce to you Dr. Jacinda Conrad, who will be presenting her ADP results. Her ADP was the impact of the National Collegiate Athletic Association's Athletic Academic Performance Program on student athlete performance and graduation rates. I was very fortunate to chair this project, and I believe you all are going to get a lot from it. So without any further ado, Dr. Conrad, take it away.
Thanks, Dr. Rice. Hello, everyone. As Dr. Rice stated, I am Dr. Jacinda Conrad, and I'm super excited to be here with you guys to share my ADP and the results that I had found. Could you go to the next slide, please? So a little bit about me. I graduated as well on September 27th, which is actually my birthday, of 2021, with my doctorate of psychology with a specialization in sport and performance psychology. I am currently working as a mental health and substance use counselor. My dream job, I would love to be a college professor and work with athletes or college or professional athletes. And I'm currently writing a book, planning a wedding, and studying to be a certified eating disorder specialist. So a little bit about myself. So when I started this applied doctoral project, what I wanted to look at was better understanding the National Collegiate Athletic Association's Division I student athletes, motivational challenges and barriers regarding academics and athletics, and any discrepancies between what student athlete graduation rates are and between their non-athlete peers. When we, next slide. When I looked at this, the problem that I saw was that overall student athletes were not performing as well as their non-athlete peers. And there have been achievement gaps identified between the two groups in graduation rates. Focus tends to be more on athletics and not academics, which can lead to lower grades and lower graduation rates. So I wanted to better understand why this was happening. Next slide. So the purpose, I completed a systematic literature review, or an SLR, and synthesized information related to student athletes, any challenges they face regarding motivation and barriers to academic success or maintaining athletic eligibility, on the field. When looking at the graduation rates I obtained, I looked at any discrepancies between what was reported by the NCAA and the federal government. And I also looked at student athletes who were in Division I, NCAA Division I schools that played football and men's basketball, so the higher revenue producing student athletes. Next slide. So what I found and why I thought this was important are that student athletes face a lot of challenges, especially maintaining their athletic eligibility to play. Why this is important, less than 2% of student athletes in the NCAA will go on to be professional athletes. So a lot of their further career or life falls back on their academics if they obtain a degree or not. And it was reported in 2008 that graduation rates for student athletes was at 86%, which is a great statistic, but it does become misleading due to the fact that the NCAA does not identify graduation rates for the general student body. So there was no comparative rate for those. Next slide. So the framework of this ADP included looking at how student athletes can become disillusioned or detached from their studies, and also looking at the burnout due to the pressures of academics and athletics and the expectations they have to meet for both. Student athletes are also entering the higher learning institutions underprepared and tend to be less academically prepared than their non-athlete peers. And the biggest factor that I had found was in reading levels for these student athletes. And then looking at pluralistic ignorance. So pluralistic ignorance would be if an individual within a group believes the attitudes of the group differ from their own personal views. So for example, if an athlete on the team sees academics as being important and needing to succeed, but they believe the rest of the team does not, then they will conform to those falsely perceived identities and beliefs in order to be accepted into the group. So this does have an impact on the motivation of student athletes in their academics. So what this project looked like, again, I conducted a systematic literature review and looked at previously reviewed research and then synthesized and tried to find themes and patterns with the information I collected. Graduation rates for student athletes were obtained from the NCAA, which is the graduation success rate that they use, and the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, or IPEDS, which is based out of the federal graduation rates and comes from the US Department of Education. When I looked at what I wanted to find was how sports psychology professionals would be able to utilize these findings to better encourage or motivate student athletes to perform better on the field, but without the inherent pressures of academic stressors, but also be able to manage those as well. And sports psychology professionals are benefits to not only a student athlete, but to teams and coaches and the universities as well. So I will talk about that when I get to my findings page. Next slide, please. So the research questions that drove this project included: what are the barriers for academic success for collegiate athletes? What discrepancies, if any, exist between what is reported by the NCAA and what's reported by the federal government, or IPEDS? And then how do student athletes' graduation rates differ from those of their non-athletic peers? So a couple assumptions and limitations for this study. An assumption was that I would find a lot of information that would fit with this research and be included based on the inclusion criteria. And then limitations as well, what would actually be included and if there was enough research to fully investigate these barriers or impacts on graduation rates and motivations of student athletes. And another limitation was my own bias, which I had several people read my project, and I did run it through a 8-step process to negate any kind of bias that I would have. Next slide, please. So this ADP was based on the foundations of 3 motivational theories: self-determination theory, which states that, well, this theory was created to help explain implications of social environments on the well-being of people who tend to engage in physical activity. Vroom's expectancy theory, has been used over various disciplines to help calculate factors or influences that motivate people. And this actually has been used to study academic motivation in collegiate athletes. And then the achievement goal theory, I like this one because it identifies the effects of perceptions of success or failure on motivation, and to understand the individual's view of competency, as well as how their environment is impacting their motivation. So a little bit about the NCAA. Intercollegiate athletics have been around since about the mid-1800s. It originally was started and continued as a student organized activity in order to provide relief from academic rigors and stressors. The Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States did start in 1906. It was later renamed the NCAA in 1910, and it was created out of national concern regarding the safety and exploitation of student athletes, and to enforce rules in order to maintain the safety of student athletes. In 1905, so a year prior to the Intercollegiate Athletic Association starting, 18 college players died and 140 were seriously injured playing football. So everyone kind of came together and realized there needs to be some kind of monitoring for these student athletes. The grant in aid concept was established to help manage the financial aid problems, funding and academic standards for student athletes. It provided more focus on recruiters being able to gain higher performing student athletes without looking much at their academic abilities. And then the term student athlete was developed in this concept because student athletes are to be students first and then athletes second. The NCAA is divided into 3 divisions. This occurred in 1973, and the universities were divided based on the size of their athletic programs, revenue that was produced from their athletic programs, athletic program funding levels, and scholarships and fan interest provided, scholarships provided to student athletes, and then fan interest for those different sports. And the amateurism model is the golden rule of the NCAA. It started in 1906 when the Intercollegiate Athletic Association began. And it does say that college athletes will not receive any compensation except for their academic fundings. This meant if they did receive any kind of compensation, they would be professional athletes and they would not be known as students anymore. Next slide, please. So why this was of concern, when I started looking at the research that I collected, when the NCAA started or began in 1906, academic success wasn't a factor implementing if athletes could perform on the field or on the court or anything like that. They were just expected to maintain a B average. When we go to 1965, athletic eligibility and academic performance were starting to be connected to each other. And in the 1960s, student athletes were only expected to maintain a 1.6 grade point average, which is below average. And then really in the 1980s, the need for an academic reform started to take place. Proposition 48 was implemented into the NCAA, and it created parameters and criteria that athletes had to meet in order to be admitted into their university or their college. And this included a minimum GPA of 2.0, an SAT score of 700, or an ACT score of 15. So it placed some parameters around student athletes being admitted. And then after doing research on this, Proposition 48, the academic performance program was established in 2003, which is the NCAA's biggest call to the academic reform. And it consists of two different rates, the graduation success rate and the academic performance rate, which is calculated twice a year to ensure eligibility for student athletes to continue playing and for teams to continue engaging in postseason championship games or anything of the such. So when we look at athletic eligibility and demands, eligibility to be admitted into a higher learning institute includes having a GPA of 2.0, SAT score of 700, or an ACT score of 15. In 1992, Proposition 16 was implemented to revise Proposition 48. So this meant that if a student athlete coming out of high school, did not have a 2.0 GPA, but had a high enough ACT score, they could be admitted based on a sliding scale. So it ultimately allowed student athletes who may not be academically prepared to enter school into those higher learning institutions. So once they're admitted, student athletes do have to maintain a certain GPA of 2.0 and also have a certain percentage of their degree completed based on the year that they're in. So for example, a student athlete would have to maintain a GPA of 2.0, but then also have 40% of their degree completed after their second year of school. And then academic success has been measured by graduation rates. So how well a school is doing or how well the student athlete or the team is doing usually is measured by the graduation rates of that sport or that school. Stereotype theory looks at, it does impact motivation for student athletes and their academic success. Stereotype theory, the term most associated with it is the dumb jock term. And the theory states that student athletes perceive a negative, they get negative feedback or whatnot from their instructors, so they don't feel competent enough to engage in some of those classes or anything like that. And it was reported in 2013 that 60% of student athletes had received negative remarks or comments by their instructors while they were in class. So next slide, please. So academic supports are offered to student athletes. These are elite programs usually that the general student body does not engage in. These are only made for student athletes. The cost of them can be very high and significant. And it was reported in 2000, it was reported that the student athletes academic supports programs had increased in cost by 43% since 2005, and only 6% for the general student body. So these academic supports that are being provided for these student athletes are very high in cost, and they are to help student athletes maintain eligibility to play and continue their academic success. And then the NCAA has left it up to these specific schools and individual schools to provide and maintain these academic supports for these student athletes. So how this project happened, I again looked at the reasons why, the barriers and the motivational barriers and challenges for student athletes in their academic success, and why they weren't achieving academic success as well as their non-athlete peers, and their graduation rates. So the intention of the project, again, I wanted to see what findings could be used and what could be implemented to help student athletes be successful. Population, there were no human participants used in this study, and then previously completed research and graduation rates from the NCAA and IPEDS were reviewed. And then peer-reviewed articles were again synthesized through the 8-step process by Opally to help identify those themes and patterns. So inclusion criteria for the peer-reviewed articles, they had to be published in scholarly journals. Qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies were considered. Studies that were on different races and nationalities were included, and then studies that reflected their own validity in answering their research questions were included. And then I selected 10 different schools from the NCAA Division I. 5 were from the Pacific 12 Conference, so Pac-12 North Division, and 5 were from the Southeastern Conference, or the SEC West Division. These schools had to have both men's basketball and football. The football teams had to be in the Football Bowl subdivision, or the FBS, and they had to have the schools had to have the highest enrollments in their conference. And then the exclusion criteria for peer-reviewed articles is they had to be published within the last 10 years. The studies where the findings didn't answer their own research questions were not included, and then only articles written in English were included. So what I had found, next slide. So again, ethical concerns, making sure I obtain the information lawfully and correctly through trusted sites, and then again, managing my own bias by having multiple people read through my project. So what I looked at is I found themes, patterns, and similarities. I reviewed 110 studies, but only 20 met inclusion criteria. And out of those 20, I then synthesized the information. And then I did pick up graduation rates from the 10 schools identified through the the NCAA and the IPEDS to compare those graduation rates. Next slide, please. So what I found is clustering, academic clustering does occur, and it is a negative impact for student athletes. And clustering occurs when 25% or more of the same team is enrolled, or if the same team is enrolled in the same major. This can be this negatively impacts motivation because student athletes may enroll in school wanting to study another major and then lose motivation because the major they have is not what they wanted to study. Underprepared student athletes was another factor I had found that impacts academic success. And it was reported in 2014 that 60% of football and basketball players at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, read between a 4th and an 8th grade level. And then it was reported again in 2015 that most schools have between 7% and 18% of their revenue producing student athletes reading at elementary levels. Next slide, please. Balancing of roles was a factor. So we're looking at which academics or athletics to put energy into in order to be successful at, because both have a lot of energy and time that need to be placed into them. And student athletes tend to report spending more than the 20 hours a week allotted by the NCAA on their athletics and in maintaining full-time student athlete enrollment. One factor that had been consistent throughout the research was motivation, and what I found is that stress and environmental demands do impact motivation, as well as the coach and athlete relationship. And then academic supports, again, are provided for student athletes, but it was found that student athletes are not utilizing these academic supports as they should, or if they are, then why aren't their academic progress or graduation rates higher for these student athletes? Next slide, please. And so the following 4 slides are just showing the difference between the graduation rates obtained from the NCAA, or the graduation success rate, and the federal graduation rate. And there is a big difference between these reports or graduation rates that are reported. And the biggest reason is because the GSR, the NCAA, includes transfer students, so students who transfer schools, where the federal graduation rate does not. So the numbers are skewed when collecting the data. You can go to the next slide, Dr. Rice. And when another thing that we see is that the graduation success rate for NCAAs that is based more on student persistence, where the federal graduation rate looks at retention rates. And you can go to the next slide, Dr. Rice. And it is not federally mandated to report any basketball or graduation rates from the NCAA, but the federal graduation rates is federally, they have to report those graduation rates to them. And so the NCAA is usually the graduation rate we see the most that's reported. And you can go to the next slide. And so there's a big difference between the two. All right, next slide. So when I look at the recommendations, so what I found is that student or sports psychology professionals, coaches, and universities would benefit from identifying a screening component or a screening tool that could be beneficial to the student athlete to help them meet their academic needs or demands, and then what barriers they're facing to get a more individualized look, and have the student athlete working with a team component as far as a sports psychology professional, a coach, and possibly an academic advisor to help them be more successful academically. And then next slide. So recommendations for future research would be conducting this project with student athletes from different sports, looking at what goals a student athlete may have and the barriers for preventing achieving those goals, and then looking at future research, conducting future research on the different student athletes in the different NCAA divisions to see what their motivation is. Next. And that is it. Thank you all for this opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Conrad. I'll offer a question here in a moment, but Dr. Sundstrom has this question. What does this tell us about the commoditization, which is basically treating something as a mere commodity? Hold on one second, I need to move it back up here, of student athletes. So what are your perceptions about how fair the student athlete system is for the students themselves? Are they being cheated of a good education to honor their sport?
In the research that I looked at, and I did look at a lot of different research articles and then books I read, and it does seem that a lot of the revenue producing student athletes tend to be more of a commodity for the school than they are students. I mean, the NCAA makes billions of dollars, and the schools make millions of dollars off these student athletes. And so I feel that, reviewing the research and looking through the research is that these student athletes don't really have a say in really their education, because their athletic eligibility is more detrimental than their academic. They have to maintain their academic eligibility to play, but they want them on the field. They don't really, so they want to put them in a different, I guess the best one would define it would be like clustering, putting them into easier majors and having the schedules be more flexible.
Right. One question I have is pertaining to stereotype threat. Obviously, one of the challenges when we think about leaders in college athletics, it would appear to me that, would you think that a lot of people within college athletics that are in coaching roles or leadership roles actually want stereotype threat to take place?
No, I don't feel that they do. But I think it's been a thing that's occurred for so long within the universities and within, the I guess stigma of what a student athlete is. And that's, I think, the big frustration is that is not what they are. But when you have I remember being in my college classes and having a student athlete come in, and it was always, oh, they're going to get away with it easier, they get to leave early. And that was just nothing I was taught. That was just the community of what was already established for these student athletes. So no, I don't feel that they want it to be a factor, because it does negatively impact the student athletes, and they're not going to put any energy into something they don't feel. And that's what I had found through the research, is they're not going to put any energy into something they don't feel they can accomplish if they're not being supported by it.
Right. Absolutely. There were a couple of comments in the chat from Dr. Ted Ellis. Thank you for presenting your research, and from Dr. Michelle Rosser Majors. Thanks for sharing your research with us, Jace. And then Dr. Stephanie Stubbs. Very interesting. So the question I would have potentially to close and would be, this is obviously doing research is not easy, right? But I mean, what are some things that you would offer to anyone that's wanting to get into this? And then I've got another question right after that. If somebody's out there that's watching this, it's in the process of maybe getting started or thinking about doing a dissertation or an ADP, what's one piece of advice you'd give?
One piece of advice I'd give, I would say, if it is a very rigorous dissertation or project, is very rigorous, and I would say ask for help when you need it. I would continue, I went through this and I was like, oh, I'll figure it out, I'll do it. And instead of asking for help or needing assistance, I tried to figure it out on my own. And it usually wasn't the right way. But I would just say ask for help when you need it, because I believe it's a stupid question, and it would be much, I guess it saves you a lot of time if you just ask and figure out how you do it instead of trying to guess.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. One last question. Actually, there are a couple of statements, but from Quentin Giese, he said, where are they on the compensating student athletes debate? They make a lot of money off of the bowl games, March Madness, etc. And he said, great job. We could go on for a long time about this. In fact, Dr. Conrad and I talked about 15 to 20 minutes about that just the other day.
Yeah.
And could you just elaborate real quickly on that, though?
Yeah, so obviously the NIL, so the name, image, and likeness, is being explored. It was implemented in July of 2021. And it would be interesting to see how this impacts student athletes and their academic success, because I'm on one side of the fence as far as I do not believe student athletes should be paid or compensated for their athletic ability, because we're already paying for their academics. And I feel that I would like to do a research in the future to see how this would impact, how you would, impact compensating student athletes. And I guess my personal opinion would be to make a division that they're just preparing themselves to go to the next level of sports or professionalism, in that way. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, because I really do feel like the NIL that was implemented is going to impact football players more than basketball or baseball players, but it would be interesting to see how it impacts them.
That's good. Good statement. And of course, we could talk about this for a long, long time. Lauren Martin stated this: I appreciate how you took the time to address and mitigate your biases in research. Thank you for the advice and presentation. And then also Dr. Rosser Major said, really great advice, Jace. So we'll go ahead and close today. Dr. Conrad, how would you like to close?
Well, Well, I just want to thank everyone for listening to my study, and you guys have my contact information. So if you do have any questions or whatnot, and my research is out there. So it's actually very interesting what I found. So thank you. And I appreciate all of you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time and taking to present today. All right, everyone, don't go away. We have another presenter coming up here, and we appreciate your coming in and watching these presentations, and hopefully you're getting something from them.